Well, hi everyone. It's Marty Park here. I'm your host again for Elevating Extraordinary Entrepreneurs. This is episode 5, and I'm really excited today to welcome my good friend Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. Sarah, welcome to our EEE broadcast.
Hey, Marty. Hey, everybody out there on the internet. I'm really excited to be here today. Thanks for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you here too. I always appreciate your energy, and on a Friday before Christmas, hey, everybody could use a little energy and a little boost of enthusiasm.
Even me.
Even you. There you go. So for some of the people that might be on may not know, but Sarah, you're a supply chain leader and a host of. I mean, one of the things we want to talk about today is podcasts. But you are the host of Let's Talk Supply Chain. You've got, I mean, your background. So I guess what I want to maybe identify for people is that we often talk about you as being a supply chain expert, and you're in whether it's the blended show, Women in Supply Chain, Let's Talk Supply Chain. I mean, you really are a figure in that industry. But what we're going to talk about today is actually sort of what your business is, which is in some ways being that voice, the podcast side of things. And so I'm going to read this out, but some of the things that to just point out just how well known you are in that space and some of the awards. But you're really recently named in the top 21 most influential leaders in supply chain by IBM and SC Digital, and also one of the top most influential women in Canadian supply chain by SCMA. I mean, those are a couple of pretty big accolades.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
been it's been a bit of a crazy ride and in a short period of time. So I've been truly grateful.
And before that, you were actually in supply chain. Before becoming a voice for supply chain, you were in supply chain for about 20 years, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I
I'm
started. So do you want me to tell you a little bit about that story?
yeah, please. Yeah, exactly what I was going to ask.
So my dad actually owned a private freight forwarding company, and so that is like a travel agent for cargo or for products. And so I
Okay,
kind of grew up in the industry. It was kind of in my blood, as I sort of
nice.
say in my story on the website. But I spent, 8 years. I started off as reception, spent 8 years in operations, 8 years in sales, and then I went on to be director of sales and marketing. So really spent, majority of my career entrenched, doing the day to day, doing the operations, and then, going on the other side of it and actually selling all of those products. So I've been in the industry
Right.
for a long time. And so I've been around to see a lot of different changes and how the industry has evolved.
And was there and so what I always wonder, like, because at some point you're in the sales and marketing side of that business. You've been through it all. You really have an understanding of the industry. And then one morning you just woke up and thought, we're missing a voice in supply chain. Or did you think, I really want to start a podcast? Like, how did you make that transition? I mean, was it fast? Was it you mulled it over for a year? Tell me that. That's one of the things I'm really
Well,
keen to hear about.
yeah, I think you know me well enough by now that you know that I don't mull things over very much.
Right.
I
So you
kind of
thought of it Friday at noon, and by Friday at 3 o'clock, it was like I had the mic in front of
Kind of.
you.
No,
Okay.
so I was director of sales and marketing, and what was important for freight forwarders at the time was that we needed to tell our brand story somewhere. And
Mm,
marketing and supply chain was just really kind of boring at the time. And that was only, 2016. But I was
right.
listening to a lot of podcasts at the time, and I was like, well, hey, if Lewis Howes can have his own podcast, why can't Sarah Barnes-Humphrey?
Right.
And and so I literally walked down the hall and asked a guy from my customs department if he would be my co-host. I got my
Okay.
team together and I was like, "Listen, we're doing a podcast. What should we call it?" And they were like, and so we came up with Two Babes Talk Supply Chain with like tongue in cheek, trying to push the
Right.
envelope of the industry.
Right.
And that's really just how it got started.
Okay. And did you? I mean, were you apprehensive about it? Like, because now I know I asked this question now for people tuned in. I mean, I know Sarah is so bold, right? She will jump into things. She's adventurous and risk taking. But Sarah, was there anything like in setting it up where you were concerned about? I don't know, finding everything from finding a unique voice to is this going to work to what do I say once I get the mic in front of me? Like, I think there's some anxiety or maybe just apprehension with a lot of people who think, yeah, maybe I should do a podcast. And then, logistics, the technology. Is there anything in your head that you were fearful of or worried about at the time?
Not really. I'm kind of one of those that are like progress, not perfection. So our
Mm.
first episode was far from perfect. I think you could probably still find it on the internet somewhere. But like the guest was on Skype on a computer behind us, and we were kind of positioned in front of it, and their video feed, like the bandwidth was no good. It was just absolutely horrible. But, as we went on and as we did each episode, we just got better and better and better. And what had kind of started it was I went on Amazon and I bought a podcasting kit and I was like, this kit is coming. I'm going to be ready to go. We're going to be able to podcast. And that was kind of it. And then we just sort of got better from there. And we ended up in studio, like we ended up going into a studio to record professionally, probably within about 6 or 7 months, maybe 8 months into the actual show.
Okay.
And so that really helped, right, with quality and different things like
Quality.
that.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
learned a lot from that experience as well. So really every episode kind of taught me, you know, a lot of,
Mm.
what was working, what wasn't working, and just sort of really doing testing. What really kind of shook my world was when my dad closed his doors and I lost my team and I lost my co-host,
Right.
and I still had this podcast going and I had companies paying to come on the show. And so I had to learn social media, I had to learn graphic design and website design and kind of really reinvent what it was that I was putting out into the world as far as
Okay.
the podcast was concerned.
Right. It's funny because you think about sometimes that progression if you start up a business, where sometimes it's like, you're changing the hours and the service mix or the different products you have, and there's an evolution there. But it's interesting to hear that there's an evolution with the podcast too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as a business and at just everything from the technology used to, the players that were involved and all of that. As you got, I'm interested, like, when you think about the progression of technology, how has the content or your approach to podcasting changed?
It hasn't changed too much, because we started the podcast really with a goal of being able to highlight companies within supply chain and what they're doing, right? And
Okay.
that has kind of really transitioned its way through until today. We haven't deviated much from that. In January 2018, I started the Woman in Supply Chain series,
Right.
and that did change things a little bit because I dedicated 1 episode a month out of 4 to women in supply chain. But by April 2018, none of them would come on the show called Two Babes Talk Supply Chain. So I had to
Right.
rebrand it, and that's why we're called Let's Talk Supply
That's
Chain now.
right.
Um, but, so I haven't really deviated from why I started it and what we wanted to do. And if I do think about deviating, I just start a new podcast.
Oh, okay. Right. But there's probably there's a brand to it, right? And you have to
Yeah.
sort of stay true to, as you said, the goal is to profile and give visibility to some of those companies in supply chain. Yeah, if
Yeah.
you all of a sudden are like, well, let's talk about, I mean, there's a different angle. You need to be able to have that separation, I think. Is there, as the goal today with Let's Talk Supply Chain, the same thing? So I would wonder, like, is there a progression in your goal, or are you still in that same space of giving voice and visibility to businesses and supply chain? Is that still the motive?
Yeah, so the podcast has stayed the same. What has changed is how we've expanded. And so we've
Mm,
expanded in a variety of different ways, right? Through the written word, through blogs, through the second podcast called Blended,
right.
through extending that even into a non for profit, and then also extending into live stream. Like live stream really only came about I mean, through LinkedIn and things like that in what, like
Right.
2019 maybe? And so I started testing that. I started just sort of testing it. I think I went live. I got my live rights on my LinkedIn page and I clicked the live button and I was like, "So guys, we're just testing. I just want to see who's out there." And all these people started popping up on the comments. And I
Right,
was like,
right, right.
"Oh, over there and hey over there." And then some of the feedback from that was like, don't focus too much on the people in the comments. I was like, "Oh, right, so I
Oh,
actually have
right, right.
to
You're, yeah, okay. Right. I still got to entertain you all. Like,
go." Yeah, so it's just sort of
and
evolved into different streams.
Sarah, has there been anything that has been a total flop in your podcasting evolution?
All the
I,
time. My
okay,
first episode after my dad closed his doors was like the sound was just horrible. I didn't know what I
right,
was doing, right? And I didn't know what to
okay,
use. And so the sound was really horrible, but I released it anyways. And it was actually at the time one of my most listened to episodes. I've tried all sorts of different things. Some work, some don't work.
right,
But I put it out there. I mean, the only way you're going to really find out what resonates and what doesn't resonate is by putting it out there and just sort of seeing what that reaction is.
totally, yeah. So, and that's actually one of that trial and error. I was wondering, is there been, if you look back now, because you have an awful lot of downloads, a significant reach, followers. I mean, you're a force in supply chain that way. Uh, has there been a specific approach you've taken that you think has sort of led to some of that success? And was it always part of your plan to get into different forms of media, or was it's all just been pretty natural?
Was I supposed to have a plan?
Okay,
So there really wasn't a plan. I mean, I've never gone to school for marketing, right?
right.
And so this was
Or
kind of
or
a whole new world.
broadcasting or anything like that.
Or broadcasting, right?
Right.
It's kind of evolved naturally. And
Mm,
as I've sort of grown in the different areas, different ideas come up, different conversations that I'm having. And so that's kind of how I've evolved the brand is really also by keeping the supply chain brands in mind. Like, what is it that they
mm,
want to do? If they want to work with somebody like us, what does that have to look like? Is it brand awareness? Is it lead
right.
generation? Is it that they want to elevate their voice in diversity and inclusion? Well, I've got a couple of opportunities for that. So, and it's funny because that woman in supply chain really evolved for me. So I
Right.
started focusing on women's journeys in supply chain. And I did that because I wanted to know more about their journeys and what that looked like, right? And then, it really turned into, well, diversity and inclusion isn't just about gender, it covers a lot of different people from different walks of life, and so
Absolutely.
I actually announced in February 2019 that I was gonna do something else in diversity and inclusion on top of women in supply chain, but I had no idea what it was. So I announced it publicly,
Right.
and then for months I had
Big
people like,
announcement. Right.
"When is this coming out? When is this coming out? When is this
Right.
coming out?" So I kind of speak things into existence.
Into creation. Yeah, exactly.
No pressure, no pressure.
And forced to
Um
manifest it.
Yeah, and honestly, I didn't know that I was gonna create the blended podcast the way that I did until probably July 2019. And then it really came together within a couple of months, and I decided that I was gonna do like a Red Table Talks for podcasts. And
Yeah.
so bringing 5 different people from different walks of life together to talk about different diversity and inclusion topics, and we launched it in October 2019
Right.
without really a plan. I mean, after that, I was like, okay, I can do one of these a month and we're going to get some sponsors and we're going to do this.
Now, how important is I talked to a guy who uh, doesn't do podcasts, but I mean, we were talking about everything from sort of a regular newsletter to blogging. And he had said that for him, the fundamental thing, and with even his podcast, became consistency. And then he
Yes.
said, everything started out with 2 downloads and then it was 5 and then it built the audience. But consistency has been so critical in his. Has that been a big piece for you too in success?
Yes. Yeah. So,
Okay.
like, the podcast comes out every single Monday. My live stream show happens every single Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern. Like, everything has its spot,
Mm.
which is really kind of funny because I'm organized, but I'm not that organized all the time.
Right.
But I recognized very early on how important consistency really was in what we were gonna put out there,
Mm.
and, I mean, that doesn't mean to say that I haven't tested and changed things. So our newsletter used to come out, I think it was on, I don't even know, maybe on a Sunday. Now our
Yeah.
newsletter comes out on a Monday afternoon after we've released the episode in the morning.
Right.
And that seems to be working a little bit better for open rates and different things like that. So there is an amount of testing that you want to do.
Okay.
And you do want to get some feedback. So, we're expanding our live shows in 2022. And so it's really important for us as well as the hosts to get some feedback. So the end of this month, we're actually putting out a survey to find out all sorts of all sorts of things from our audience as to why they, watch a show, why they watch it for as long as they do, where are they located, what day of the week is good. So
Right.
feedback is always really good for that testing, but consistency really is key.
That's great. Actually, I was going to ask about, because you talk about, starting women in supply chain. It was some of it that you wanted to hear some of that, some of those stories, and give us some exposure. But I was just curious, like over the years, if you've created feedback or just maybe even haphazardly and randomly gotten emails where you think that's a good idea, we should incorporate that. But to
Mhm.
hear that you formalize that a little bit to now it's like we're actually asking our audience and our market, that makes great sense. And I love the
Yeah.
structure too, that it obviously works for you and the team, knowing that, hey, the deadline is Monday, Tuesday, we've got this. But I like the flip side of that, that for the audience, there's some consistency of knowing it's going to be in their inbox or available for download at those set times too, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's taken us a while to get there, right?
Okay, right,
This all didn't happen overnight. I mean, I've been doing this on my own since 2018, the beginning of
right.
2018, and now we're at the beginning of 2022. I now have a team of about 14 people that are
Wow,
all running the back end of everything that we're doing. Because there's so many moving parts, there's so many different things that we are doing. And I think one thing to mention actually in 2021 is that I franchised the podcast. I think I'm the first person
right.
ever to franchise a
Franchise
podcast.
a podcast. Yeah, that's right.
And so that was never on the roadmap.
I think
Um,
that looks a lot like the Amazon box, right? It shows up, it's Let's Talk Supply Chain on it. You open up, you're like, here's my microphone and my, yeah, except I don't get Sarah popping out of the box.
yeah, that's true. That's true. So yes, we do have a box that's sent out and all that kind of stuff.
Now, Sarah,
But
let me ask you, when you in going through all this, like all the way to the now franchising it, and you said, the audience you have and all the systemization you have, the team of 14 people. Has there been any point where you're like, I guess sort of beating yourself up? Because I think that sometimes we really expect immediate success in launching something like a podcast. Have you had times where you felt like I'm not doing it fast enough or good enough or been frustrated with that growth, or has it been pretty easy going?
so many times. Like
Okay.
the first year, not having a salary and sort of like just putting one foot in front of the other, not really knowing where this podcast was going to go and if it was actually, really going to be able to make me enough money to live my life. It's taken me a couple
Right.
of years to get there. Whole first year, I was kind of like, what am I doing? I'm not even sure if I should be doing this. Is this going anywhere? Am I the right person to do this? There's so many thoughts as an entrepreneur that go through your
Right.
head when you're building something. Imposter syndrome, self doubt, all of that. I have dealt with
I,
all
I
of
don't know what those things are. I don't know what you're talking about.
that.
But actually, you bring up a great point. And so I have to dive into this. When you started, because a lot of people do podcasts on the basis like maybe this will support my business, or I just, I mean, I can think of in the sports space where it's like two guys drinking beer, talking sports, and then they're like, we should do a podcast, right?
Yeah.
And it's really meant as a bit of a hobby. But you bring up the idea like you get into this and you're like, I didn't take a salary, but it sounds like the intention was I'm going to try and build a business around a podcast, not just do it as a hobby.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I wanted to do, but I've always had my
Okay.
hands in various different things.
Yeah.
So at the
Yeah.
same time as building the podcast, I was also building a tech company and I was also, trying to get a patent for a product and different things like that. And so for me, it was
Right.
kind of like, well, something's going to work. So let's figure out what that is by, putting one foot in front of the other, keep going and saying yes to opportunities. I think
Wow.
that's one really big thing that I could leave the audience with is really putting yourself out there and saying yes, whether it scares the crap out of you or not. I can tell you when I started this journey, I was terrified of speaking in public, and I still kind of am. Like, I really, really
Right.
get nervous. And a lot of people are like, really? What's wrong with you? You do
But
this
you're
all
a
the time.
natural. Right.
And I was nervous getting on a live stream and I was nervous, getting on camera, and now it sort of comes naturally, right?
Right.
And I really enjoy doing that. And so the fact that it evolved into something that I could actually make a living off of and that I could provide for 14 people that are working with me on a consistent basis, is really quite humbling.
Did you, when you think about the fact that you thought, I've got to make this into a business as opposed to just do it as sort of an activity, do you think that is part of the reason that it's grown the way it has and has become sort of a commercial success? Like what I'm getting at is like just the intention of I'm going to run a podcast that's going to become a business. Has that actually, in fact, informed your success?
Never had that thought, really.
Okay.
I just
Okay.
kept going with the flow and just kept kind of doing my thing and sort of seeing where it was taking me. But there was one point, end of 2019, I think, or 2020, where I was like, oh, okay, like this is getting real.
Right.
So I'm
Right.
going to need a lot of help because at
Right.
that point, I think I only had two people that were working with me.
Okay. Wow.
And so
Now you're
over
at
the last
14.
year, now we've
Crazy.
grown exponentially. Yeah.
Um, I always think about podcasts and the brand that comes with it, and oftentimes, it's the Joe Rogan brand, or it's and there's that person that's behind it, right? I think of Rich Roll or Tim Ferriss or Sarah Barnes-Humphrey, right? Where there's let's talk supply chain. Do you think it matters if I start a podcast? So, for the audience, does it matter if I start a podcast as an individual? Marty Park's going to start it. Do I start it as a company? Evolve Business Group. Have you seen an advantage to one or the other, or a difference of approach that works better?
I think it depends who your target market is, right? Like
Hmm.
if it's business to consumer, it might be different than business to business. So a lot of
Right,
what I do is business to business, right? From a sales standpoint, but my
right,
audience is still kind of business to business professionals, right? It's still not
right, right.
necessarily your end consumer where I'm selling shoes to somebody, right?
Yeah, of course. But you're
So I
still, I
think
mean, you appreciate that you're still talking to an end person there, right?
an end
That you're
person.
you're trying to connect with us. Yeah,
Yeah, and so, I think it depends on and I think it depends on what you're doing with your life. Is it a side hustle? Is it something that you want to turn into a business one day? Do you want your personal brand to be linked to the podcast, or do you want to
mm,
keep them separate? Because if you keep them separate, you can actually have a variety of different revenue streams for both.
right. What would you say, Sarah, to the person who thinks about doing a podcast and then goes, "Well, there's already a bunch in my industry, or there's
Mhm.
already a bunch in that space." Would you tell them to still jump in, and why?
Yeah, I would, but you've got to do it differently. You got to figure out
Hmm.
what's out there and what's going to make you different. What makes me different in the market from a podcasting perspective is because I do focus on the brands within supply chain. I don't
Right.
focus on a topic,
Ah.
right? So
Okay. Right. So just that little nuance.
yeah, it makes me very unique in a market of a variety of different podcasts in supply chain.
Right. Um, and it's funny how, yeah, you can take the same content, but when you think of it from a company perspective as opposed to a topic perspective, like it doesn't. I guess what I was trying to think of or identify as sort of all the different ways that you could find your own voice, right? It could be
Yeah.
format of the show, it could be the focus, it could be, yeah, like there's a lot of different ways to be able to find that, even though you might think you're in a busy space.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are all really good examples, right?
Right.
You could do a 5-minute podcast. You could do an hour and 45-minute podcast. But it's what
Right.
you do with that time that's going to differentiate yourself and also decide for you whether it's going to make revenue or not. Maybe you're going to start a podcast and it's not about creating a business and not about creating revenue. Maybe
Right.
it's just because you love doing it and it's what you want to do.
Yeah. It's something you love talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
And I mean,
representing.
depending on where you want to go with it, right? There's also the content. So is the content relevant to today? Is it relevant to tomorrow? Is it relevant to 6 months from now? Is it relevant to a year from now?
So
What do
are
you
you
want
saying that
your
when you
relevancy to
think, right, when you think of the content, do you think of it from that evergreen sort of
be? Yes.
state? Like it's got to be relevant all the way in the future, not just this is a hot topic today.
Yeah, because if you
That's
go
a
on a
great insight.
podcast and you're talking about a topic that's hot right now, well, the content kind of goes stale in 2 months if
Yeah,
it's
of
not
course.
really something that people are talking about anymore.
Wow,
And so
that's
what does
really
that
insightful.
do for you? What does that do for your business? What does it do for your clients?
Right. Do you so I'll use myself as an example. So I've toyed with the idea of podcasting. And I say toyed because I've actually been one of those people who've gone, there's so many podcasts, we don't need another one. Right.
Right.
And then a little bit of that, what's that unique angle? But if I was to say, okay, I think I've got my lane, I've got my topic and I know my approach that I think I can create that differentiation. What would you say are going to be the biggest challenges for me in launching a podcast?
Well, what does success look like for you? So
Mm,
some people launch a podcast for their client base as it is right now, to give
okay.
them something on a consistent basis to listen to from you that will, remind them of different things maybe that they should be thinking about or doing or etc. If
Right.
you're doing a podcast for the masses, maybe success for you is, I don't know, 200 downloads. Maybe success for you is 15,000
Sorry.
downloads.
Did you say 200,000 downloads? That's right.
No, but some people don't wanna go big,
Eh,
and they really
right.
just wanna reach a niche audience, and 200 downloads a month is good enough for them, and they get a lead out of it every month.
Right. Actually, I have a very good friend who's in that he's such a targeted niche. He's like, it's one industry, it's one group. I could, the directory for the entire industry across North America is probably 15 pages. And he gets those downloads, but it drives business, it drives his expertise. My motivation, thank you for identifying that because my motivation is different than what he's using it for.
Yeah,
What do you think about the technology side? I mean, is it complicated for people? I think that's a place where also people get nervous. Is like,
so
how am I
much.
going to edit it? Who do I? So tell me about that.
I mean, I don't edit my own episodes, I never have. I've
Okay.
tried. I've tried, but
Right. Right.
definitely not my thing.
Right.
So there's a lot of people out there that are really good at editing episodes. There are people out there that will produce the whole thing for you and put it out
Right.
on social media if that's what you want. I mean, it really depends on what your budget is. I have had somebody who edits my episode that's been with me for a while, but I went through a few people before I found him.
Right.
And he works really well with us. I don't even think I've met him in person.
Wow.
Right? And then when you think about the recording software, I mean, there's a lot of them out there, right? Like I use
Right. Right.
Zencaster, which now allows for video. So now I can do audio and video.
Right.
And so we release each episode in a variety of different formats. And then there's a variety of different hosting formats, right? There's Libsyn, there's Buzzsprout, there's all sorts. And it really just depends on what makes it easier for you and which one you want to use.
Right. And I think one of the nice things is, as you said, when there's this evolution of the equipment you use, I mean, you can get set up on Zencaster and pick your platform and have somebody doing it. And that doesn't mean it's static, right? There's going to be some change and some improvement. Did you know right out of the gate that you didn't want to become the back end technician? Or was it something you
Yes.
had to discover, like, I'm good at this and I'm clearly not good at that?
A lot of it I had to discover,
Right.
and some
Okay.
of it I had to do anyways. Like, honestly, if you see my graphics from the beginning of 2018, whoo, man,
Ooh,
I mean, somebody should be embarrassed about those. I don't know
right.
who, but
I'm
somebody.
still using Corel Draw.
Um, Canva was foreign to me at that point.
Right.
But yeah, I tried my hand at everything. At some point I had to do all of it because I had nobody else. And this was the other thing to think about too, is from the very beginning, I was the only asset that I had that would work for free.
Mm,
So
wow.
the goal wasn't for me to be, the person that was going to do everything. That was not my
Right.
goal. My goal was to create a platform that other people could use. But in the beginning, like I said, I was the only asset that I had that would work for free. So
Right.
I had to work with it.
Actually, so that leads into my question around budget because you mentioned, like, there's some equipment start. Maybe now I've got somebody who's handling some of the post production work and I got to pay them. I mean, what would you say if I was starting out a podcast or listeners were starting out a podcast to budget? What's a reasonable budget to begin with so that you've got a little bit of runway?
For like equipment and stuff, I mean, Zencaster, I think you can use for free up until a certain point.
Okay.
Equipment, you don't really have to spend a lot of money on. I mean, you can get a webcam for less than $100 and you can get a
Right.
microphone and a microphone stand and maybe a ring light.
Right. Well,
for
you've
it.
got the fancy microphone, and I think that's the idea, is that I've got to go get a Blue Yeti. I've got to have
No.
headphones. I've got to have all this, upgraded all. So I like the idea, or what you're suggesting is like, it doesn't need to be that complicated, and maybe it's simpler than listeners think it is.
Well, and some of my best episodes are the ones with the worst sound.
Hmm.
Like, my most downloaded
Interesting.
episodes are some with the worst sound.
And is it because the topic has, I mean, it's really hit home in terms of content?
I don't know because I can't ask
Not
them.
sure. Right. Why do you, yeah, really like to survey the 14,000 people that downloaded this episode?
On Apple and Apple will not give up that information.
No. Now, I want to ask you, because I think this is a really, one of the things I love about your transition from, your previous career or your job into becoming the Let's Talk Supply Chain host, and I guess sort of the top of that pyramid that you've built. You've also got a lot of revenue streams, and I think what people think of as the only model is, I do a bunch of podcasts, and then eventually somebody wants to sponsor it, and I can charge a little bit of money for sponsorship, and that's the model. But can you
Mhm.
talk about all the things you've discovered in terms of revenue streams that can come from podcasting?
Yeah, podcasts is a form of digital content. So, how can you take that form of digital content and turn it into something that's valuable for somebody else?
Right.
Right? So, the different revenue streams we have are ads on the podcast, which is generally, what you do with a podcast is that you get somebody to
Right.
sponsor and do ads.
Yeah.
But we also have sponsorship opportunities for women in supply chain or blended.
Mm,
We've got like companies pay to come on the show because of the
right.
content that we provide them and because the value that it offers to them. 90% of guests that come on my show close business from being on the show. That is
Wow.
really valuable to my clients,
Right. Right.
right? And then, we've turned it into blog spots and all sorts of different things, including live streaming. And so now we've built the platform up to a place where brands want to live stream their own shows across our platforms. And what we've done is we've really talked to them about what is something that they want to focus on for 2022. Is it brand awareness? Is it lead gen? So we have those types of conversations to ask them those questions, and then we
Wow.
cater the content around that for them. What are they having challenges with around digital content? What would they like to see
Right.
more of? What would they like to have access to? And so that turns into conversations about franchising. That turns into conversations about hosting their own show and letting us do everything because we've got everything down to a science. That's led to other podcasts coming to us as a production house and they want us to produce it for them. So it really turns into, all sorts of different opportunities. I mean, this year I launched
Right.
a LinkedIn learning course about sustainable supply chains, the fundamentals of sustainable supply chains, and that came through my work through Let's Talk Supply Chain. Now that's for my
Right.
personal
Because
brand.
LinkedIn approached you about that course.
Yeah, yeah, and that's for
Right.
my personal brand, right? Not
Okay.
necessarily Let's Talk Supply Chain, but all of these opportunities sort of come out of everything that you're doing.
Right. I love that. Thank you for explaining it, because I think it shows the depth of even the idea that other podcasts then start to come to you and say, "You do such a good job with production. Can you help us with ours?" Or like
Yeah,
the blog spot, right? That there's again, that you create enough brand that now there's a lot of different ways you can use that digital media or different mediums that you have influence with. Now, can
yeah.
you your audience is pretty large too. And so once I imagine, well, I know once you get that audience, other people want to jump on your bandwagon to be
They
like,
do.
hey, if you have this many people's ears, we'll pay to get in front of that group. Right.
Mhm. Yeah, well, and we're
But
doing something right because it's not just about the number of followers, it's also about the engagement from those followers. And we have a
okay.
very high percentage of people that engage with our content.
And is that like, is there something you specifically do that then creates that engagement? Like, is it intentional in the way you deliver something, or almost like, the idea of, if it's people say, well, here I put out a blog or I put out a newsletter, and it's like, well, you're going to create more engagement if you've got places to be able to click and follow through. Is there anything you do in the formatting of a show or in your approach that creates engagement better than
I
most?
I don't I don't know. I mean, at the end of the
Hmm.
day, we're not pretending to be anything that we're not,
Right.
and we just sort of do what we do and we produce the content that, and we're consistent in the content that we create, right? For the
Right.
podcast, companies come on and talk about who they are and what they do.
Right.
Right? That is what we're known for. You can go onto our website if you have a supply chain challenge, you can go onto our website and you can search the challenge that you're having, and all sorts of content will come up on that challenge, and some of that are solution providers. And you can listen
Right.
to the podcast and be like, "Oh, that's how they've helped them. Okay, maybe they can help me with my challenge." And so that puts us in a very unique position within the industry. Right? And I think, comments, the way that you ask questions maybe through social media as
Right.
well, um, the content has evolved, from just a static graphic to an audiogram and now to a video snippet. So
Right.
constantly having to, change your approach in how you're releasing content and what that kind of looks like, and making it authentic. I think really just authentically sharing and authentically asking questions and authentically creating conversations within the community is really just what people are looking for.
I've listened to your show, and I think your authenticness comes through in a lot of those interviews and the questions that when I wrote a book, one of the things they said, good advice was like, what's the voice you want to have in
Hmm.
writing the book, right? So I had to sort of profile it to be able to say, I want it to be confident, I want it to be empathetic, I want it to be a little bit contrarian, I want it. And I was like, okay, so that's the voice. Have you got the same thing where, in addition to authentic, there's sort of a definition you have of this is my voice, or this is what the Let's Talk supply chain voice is going to be?
Not really. They're kind of the same. I
Okay.
mean, if you
Okay.
if you
Yeah.
meet me in person or you hear me on a podcast, you're gonna get the exact same person every single time. I can't pretend to be
Right.
something that I'm not. But what it has done is it's translated the Let's Talk Supply Chain brand into, into a couple of different things, and then it's also translated my personal brand. So there are a few words that intertwine, but then there are a
Okay.
few words that kind of separate us, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. There's overlap, but there's also a little bit of distinction there.
But you've also gotta give yourself time to explore what that is and just be yourself, and then naturally, those words are gonna come through what you're already doing. And that's one of the things, the guidelines that we give to the hosts of our live shows. Don't be something that you're not. Show up as
Mm,
you. Right?
right.
Share authentically, be you. I mean, don't swear because you can't swear, but be you and
Right.
don't pretend to be something that you're not, because it's just not going to come across very well.
I always feel like the persona you put forward has to be authentic because it's a lot like dating. You can put on a bit of a persona for a little while, but by month two or three of dating, it starts to be hard to keep that up, right? And I think the same thing. By episode 20, you're like, I can't keep up this facade anymore.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, like on a Tuesday, I'll record 3 times. I'll go live in the morning, I'll record a podcast, and then I'll record another podcast or whatever. I'm
Right.
exhausted by the end of the day. If I was trying to pretend to be something that I'm not, I I'd be in bed by 5 o'clock. I mean, I just don't know how I would do it, you know?
Right. Right. What have you done? And maybe if so, again, we'll go back. One of our listeners launches a podcast. Is there anything you can give as advice to promoting your podcast, to getting listenership, to creating that following?
Well, you already have, I would assume that you've already got like friends and family and different people that you can reach out to. So I would build, your email list from that. And I
Okay.
would get people excited about it. And I would utilize that list too, right? Because you want them to go on and you want them to rate and review the show as soon as you publish it.
Right.
Right? So you need your friends and family to be able to do that, because it would be very difficult to get strangers to do that. And that's
Sure.
what's going to get you sort of started really well on the right footing to start. And then you want to pick a platform. Like if you don't have time to do LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Clubhouse, like
Right.
I could name a whole bunch of them.
Mm,
And
yeah.
if you're listening to me going, I have to do all of that, no, you
Oh, that
absolutely do not.
plus the podcast.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. Pick a place. Pick a place. Like LinkedIn is a big, big, big platform for us. We use LinkedIn like crazy.
Right.
Twitter and Instagram are a fast second. Um, but start where you can, and don't overstretch yourself. Because remember, consistency is key,
Right.
right? So you need to be able
Right.
to do what you're creating right now for 12 months. If you go overboard and you're completely burnt out by month 3,
Right. Which I
you're
think
not
is
going
what
to be able to be
happens, right?
consistent. Yeah.
There's lots of people who are like, yeah, I've got to throw all this stuff and it's not sustainable. I was like good marketing, you get one or two strategies working and then you can add a third and add a fourth. Um,
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense to me. Is there, and you bring up a good point, like when you talk about promotion, you sort of allude to the idea like there's a launch sequence or a launch thing so that you can't just come out of the gate and be like, well, my mom downloaded the first one. And, I got my brother to download the second. And like, it's got to be like out to your network, to your community. There's a bit of it's coming so that when it hits and that ask of, hey, review this and create some buzz to, I guess, sort of create that traction to pull other people in.
That's a really good point, is that you want to be talking about it way before you launch. So for
Okay.
my tech company, I know I'm deviating from the podcast, but for my
That's
tech
okay.
company, I had it on my like on stages. When I would go on stages, it would be in my bio 18 months before we even launched it. So people were used to seeing the brand
Right.
in a variety of different ways. I'd put the logo on different things. And so by the time we launched it, everybody wanted to know about the brand and what it was.
That's a great idea. It's funny, I never thought about it like that, but I was talking about the book long before the physical cover was done, right? But I think the key is in both those situations, you'd made a commitment to it, and I'd made a commitment on the writing side. And it was like, well, this is something I know I'm going to do. So, for listeners, it is one of those things you have to make a commitment to start that moving forward. And sometimes just making that decision is enough that if you say it enough times, you almost create the public pressure to be like, I guess I better get going with that now.
Yeah, but don't get overwhelmed with it either. Like if it takes you 18 months to launch, or if it takes you 2 years to launch and you've been talking about it, or if you don't at all, I mean, that would be the worst case scenario. But
Sure.
if it just don't get overwhelmed with it. It needs to come
Mm.
naturally and not come forced, because again, you have to be able to sustain it. And if you can't sustain it, then there's really no point,
Right.
because consistency is key and it's going to take you a while. Like you have to keep going. It's not going to happen in the first month. It's not going to happen in the third month. It's not going to happen in the 6th month, right? It may or may not, right? It may
Right.
not even happen until the 18th month. But if you enjoy what you're doing and the content that you're putting out, that is what's going to keep you motivated to keep going. If you've got people who are listening and your numbers are going up, whether it's by one person a month or, slowly or fast or whatever that looks like, you just keep going, because eventually everything that you put into it is going to come to fruition.
That's beautiful. That was really well said. Thanks, Sarah. I mean, and the word I heard in there was enjoy, and that idea of, I think, developing it from a place of you're going to enjoy it. It's an enjoyment. It's a joy to produce and do. Right. It can't feel like, man, this is work.
Yeah.
I
No, no,
I
no.
also think about for me the competitiveness of finding somebody else who's got a podcast and just making sure that my downloads are consistently just a little more ahead of theirs. If I was battling with my friend Dom, I'd be like, "How many did you get?" "Yeah, I beat you by one," and that would keep me going.
Well, you could do that, but I think also at the same time is you
I
also
think
can't
joy's a
get
better
caught up.
strategy.
Well, you
Right.
can't get caught up in what everybody else is doing, because whatever they're doing really doesn't matter to you.
Thank you.
It's
That's
you
great
gotta
advice.
focus on what you're doing and the joy that you're spreading in the world and the joy that you're bringing to yourself
Mm,
and what it actually means for you and for your audience and, everything that you're doing.
that's fantastic. What? I'd like to end on that because it's such a succinct motivator for anybody that's listening in today. Sarah, if somebody wants to know more about, let's talk supply chain or about podcasts or about you, what's the best place for them to reach out or find you?
How much time do you have? Just asking. I'm just kidding.
Uh,
So, you can go to letstalksupplychain.com and you can
okay.
find all of our live stream shows. You can find both podcasts. You can find the franchise. So everything's there. You can also follow me, Sarah Barnes-Humphrey on LinkedIn. You can also follow Let's Talk Supply Chain on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. We have a really fun
Oh, thank you for that. I mean, man, if somebody can't find you on the web, please reach out to me because boy,
I'm doing
I
something
checked
wrong.
all. That's right, exactly. You're clearly spelling Sarah Ring properly, or I don't know. Sarah, I just want to say thanks so much for your insights. It's inspiring for me as somebody thinking about podcasting, and I really like some of your points of where it comes from, the authenticity, it's just some of those things of the consistency and keep going. I think those are great suggestions. So thanks for your time today. For everybody that's joined in, thanks so much for joining us on episode 5 of Elevating Extraordinary Entrepreneurs. Sarah, all the best of the season, and to all our listeners, all the best of the season.
Thank you, Marty. I just want to say, if anybody is not following Marty, you need to go and press that follow button right now. He has done tremendous things for me and my business in the last, I think it's only been a year, which is crazy to me. And so I just want to say thank you to you and your team and everybody at Evolve for everything that you've done for me in 2021. And I encourage everybody to reach out to Marty.